Anansi's a spider, the first Spider-Man. Him come over from Africa on the slave ship to these lands. Look at him. A tiny spider. Him could have fit into the palm of your hands. Close your eyes. Him take him magic and stretch up into a tall, handsome black man. Now while all the other spider them working and spinning webs all day, Anansi decide he was born to fool around, skylark and play. Him look out at Garrett A. Morgan, the black man who invented the street lights to brighten our way and save lives every day. Anansi said, that is not for me. I not work that hard in any way. Listen to Anansi's story, hear about him tricky way. But maybe little Anansi live in all of us in our own special way. Anansi came from the Akan people, and there in that section of Ghana, many tribes live, and he is a mythical spider god figure to them. Anansi came from that part of the world, and the African people who were turned into slaves carried these stories with them of Anansi, a tiny spider who overcame so many obstacles. So the stories became very important to them because he is, after all, a god in a sense with these magical powers.
In our culture, I could say Anansi came from Africa, but Anansi is in a lot of different cultures and given different names, sometimes pronounced with the same spelling but pronounced differently. So there is Anansi in different culture. If we look at Africa as the birthplace of civilization, then yeah, we could say Anansi originated in Africa.
I had no sense of Anansi being anything, and no sense of the West African connection to Anansi. We weren't told or taught anything in the school system itself about Anansi. This was something that went on in the village with the folks, as it were. So I didn't know Anansi to be anything but this great trickster. Among a number of the stories we were told, of course, growing up. But Anansi stood out as the key guy when I look back on it. And it's always been a fascinating figure, really, tell you the truth, fascinating figure. And coming to Canada, it was really actually, ironically, I learned more about Anansi in terms of the West African connection and all of those. So life is so full of ironies, man. Something Anansi might like too.
My name is Patrick Parson. I am the founder and artistic director of Ballet Creole, which was founded 12 years ago with the School of Performing Arts. I am the choreographer for Spider in the Snow.
Passionate person, because when I read through the story and thing, you know, it's the person who has compassion for this person who is a very selfish trickster. Okay? Now the selfish trickster, right, is Anansi, Nikisha. You playing the Raven all the time, Bat, the Raven. Now who is that? What is that? Okay? That's another trickster. But it's not a trickster like the Anansi, which is selfish. It's a trickster that is not selfish. He tricked people to help other people. It's almost like Robin Hood. Right? So that's what I need you to start to think about.
Well, I mean, a trickster is just a tricky guy, a slick guy, funny, clever, sort of like a kind of a storyteller pimp, kind of. You know what I mean? Somebody who's flashy, you know what I mean? He's got a slick tongue where he always has something in the conversation and always has a way of getting over, you know what I mean? And just does it without a kind of guile. It's not a vicious kind of something, you know what I mean? You're almost having fun being ripped off or being taken over by a trickster, really. I mean, you know, what I mean, they leave you laughing when they leave with your shit.
I would say a trickster is a cunning individual who always sees a way to gather things for himself and will go about it at first without remorse or without any kind of consideration as to the consequences.
A trickster is not just someone with a creature with human characteristics. It's a creature with spiritual characteristic as well. For example, a raven among the First Nations people in Canada is very much a spiritual character and raven does things to help human beings.
It's not hard to manifest the character in itself, but in dealing with all the intricacies of what Anansi says and do all the time, when it comes to movement embodiment, it becomes a little complicated. For verbal translation is easier. Dramatizing it's easier for me than transforming it, the character, into movement. And not just to transform it into movement, but to say something of importance and tangible.
I don't think that the story of Anansi in the snow mirrors the experience of the West Indians and the Africans who come into Canada. Because in that story, Anansi's exploiting other people. And I doubt that there are many immigrants who get an opportunity to exploit anybody in Canada.
Most West Indians and West Africans who voyaged to Canada weren't necessarily stowaways on a boat who, manipulated to get their way in their country. And I also think most West Indians and West Africans did not benefit from such generosity from people being very welcoming them into their homes. And Anansi in the snow, the interesting thing about the story is that Anansi on his adventures encounters many people who are very generous and open and encouraging of this stranger. Of my own family, I can only speak of my own familial experience. I don't think that welcoming aspect is parallel between the two experiences.
Definitely the experiences of Anansi echoes the movement of West Indians to Canada. I mean, as the earlier movement from Africans to the West Indies, you know what I mean? And if we move from here, Canada, to somewhere else, it'll be another once removed. But the situation of movement, of being an immigrant, of relocating, calls for a whole lot of smarts. And if Anansi is one thing, he is absolutely full of smarts. Quintessential hustler, as it were. And immigrants got to be hustling, got to hustle. You got to relocate, you got to get someplace to live, you got to get a job, you got to learn the language, the culture, the movements, you got to learn how to maneuver, how to get over in that too. And all of those kinds of trickster things that Anansi sort of might have instilled in people.
There are a couple of barriers that are against us in Toronto, or I would say in Canada, and that is our culture most times are not seen as high art. I have been in a lot of what we call sounding of the arts, where we try to depict the difference between folk art, contemporary art, and traditional art. And there's a lot of confusion in that setting. So if you're doing high art with any type of traditional overtone or undertone, it's seen by the powers that be that it's called folk art. And where there's folk art or traditional art, the idea is that we all do it.
There are always lessons to be learned from Anansi stories. In fact, there are always lessons to be learned from all folk tales. Now, as I said earlier, Anansi may behave in a way. I said, you're a regular Anansi. He's so greedy. He's so selfish. He's so mean-spirited and so on. All right. Isn't there a lesson in that?
I think that many African stories, the animals in the story are used to teach moral lessons to children. Many people do not know that Aesop, of the Aesop fables, was actually an African slave who had been captured in Greece. And so all his stories tell of different moral values. When Anansi loses, it is good for people to see that things do not always work the way you expect them to work. So I think it's good for everybody to see that.
Anansi stories really teach us and can teach us to find ways of getting out of things. You know what I mean? To use those things that you have as a human being, which is your own person in the midst of whatever, you know what I mean? Like Anansi. You put him into any situation, the Middle East and so on. You put him into Afghanistan. You put him into the most war and killing and gang warfare and thing. You put him into knife stabbings at the dance on Saturday night. And Anansi, given the problem, will walk out of any of those joints and situations. And everybody will have a good time while he's doing it too.
There's that known fact that it's good to learn from other people's mistake as opposed to your own, you know, and Anansi basically put the information out there for us to decipher, and especially in the age of which we're at today, technology, a lot of information coming at you, you know, you've got to have the ability to decipher and choose your road, you know, adequately, or else you'll be totally lost, you know. So I think Anansi bring that message to us, and it's even relevant today.
Because I see art as part of the circle of life, now, I look at it as a whole, whereas we all understand the art, understand where it comes from, and understand the rest that supports it. And in that way, it will be totally integrated. Whereas the professional businessman and the professional artists, the educators, the anthropologists, understand where we fit in that circle of sharing education and higher education, and actually what a profession is. Because we have this idea that certain things are not a profession but hobbies, and to be integrated we have to broaden our horizon about what a professional person is. And once we understand that art fits in that circle of professionalism, the integrated artistic community will be more visual.
Spider in the snow. One fine morning, Anansi the spider decided that he would go down to where the ships docked and seek an early adventure. He decided, instead of his usual stowaway trips to the neighboring islands, he would chance getting on a bigger ship to go in search of a new island. Anansi saw the bigger ship and, as usual, found his way onto the vessel without paying. His first pleasure, once on board, was to find the galley. He made his way below deck, past the cabins, and into the huge kitchen. Greedy Anansi was devouring as much food as possible, fell asleep from overeating. On the seventh day, he noticed something different. The engines were quiet. He quickly ran up on deck. There before him were lots of people leaving the ship. There were vast acres of land unlike any other island he'd ever seen. Anansi saw his chance and quickly slipped ashore. After a while of wandering around, Anansi soon felt lost and homesick. The new land was a strange place to him. For one, it had no palm trees, and it was very chilly. Night was beginning to fall, and Anansi had walked for miles. He was hungry and tired, with nowhere to lay his head. Anansi began to feel despair, thinking that he would never see any of his friends again. He was about to lay down his head when he heard a voice calling out, "Are you okay?" He looked up and saw standing before him a young boy. The boy asked again, "Are you lost?" Anansi's face brightened. "Who are you?" he asked. The little boy replied, "My name is Joshua. What's yours?" "My name is Anansi. Do you know where I am?" "Of course I do. I live here. This is Canada." Joshua invited Anansi home with him. There he met Joshua's family. They were very kind. They gave him lots of food to eat, like cornbread and fish. Anansi enjoyed Joshua's family so much, he spent the night. The next morning, Anansi was awakened bright and early by Joshua. At the breakfast table, he learned that Canada gets very cold in the winter and that it snowed very hard. Anansi had never seen snow before and wanted to see it. That morning, Joshua's family filled a bag with food and drink, gave him some warm clothes, and set him on his way back to find the ship. On his way, Anansi began to think to himself, "Canadians are very kind. I would like to meet more of them. And besides, I would like to see the snow." He devised a plan. He lay down on the ground, pretending to be lost, waiting for the next stranger to stumble over him. Anansi was beginning to get up to his old tricks again. News traveled across the land that Anansi, the spider, was taking advantage of many families, telling them that he was lost, eating and drinking their food and abusing their goodwill. One morning, when Anansi was pretending to be lost, he fell asleep. He was awakened by a strange noise. He looked up to see Bart the raven. Now, Bart was renowned in his community for stealing other ravens' berries and hiding them in his nest. "Good morning, Mr. Spider-Man. You look lonely and afraid. Is something wrong?" Anansi replied in a weakened voice, "Yes, I have traveled a long way from my country, and I am lost and very hungry." "Well, I am sure that I can help you, but first I need you to help me." "How can I help you?" asked Anansi. "I am very hungry and weak. Winter is fast approaching, and it's customary for us to gather as much berries as possible to store for food until spring," explained Bart. Bart and Anansi went across to the berry trees, and sure enough, they were filled with ripe red berries. "How will we get them into the bags without stinging our hands?" asked Anansi, "especially since I am weak and tired." "No problem, Mr. Spider-Man. All you have to do is shake the trees as hard as you can, and they will fall into my bags." Anansi agreed to shake the trees, and tons of berries fell into the large bags. Suddenly, it began to snow, and Anansi, who had never seen snow before, asked Bart, "Why are all of those white speckles falling from the sky?" Bart explained to him that it was snow. He was so excited that he shook all the berries from the trees. Soon, all the bags were filled. Anansi told Bart that he had waited so long to see snow, and he wanted to play for a while. But Bart reminded him that he was tired and hungry. Anansi replied, "I'm no longer hungry and tired since I have seen the snow." Bart was happy to hear him say that and suggested that if Anansi helped him carry the bags home, he would come back and build him a snowman. Anansi happily agreed. Anansi was so excited about the idea that he carried all 10 bags back to Bart's home by himself. Bart and Anansi began to play in the snow. Bart built a big snowman. Anansi danced with joy. Then Bart had an idea. He said to Anansi, "How about I make a snowman out of you?" Anansi was so overjoyed. He agreed, and Bart began to build a snowman around Anansi. Bart took berries and stuck them in the ears and mouth. He left the eyes for Anansi to see out of. Then Bart disappeared. Anansi began to wail and cry out for help. He pleaded with God to forgive him for being so selfish. Just then, he heard the voice of someone singing. He cried out, "Help! Help!" He noticed a young man coming towards him. It was Joshua. "Joshua," he cried, "it's me, Anansi." "Is that you, Anansi?" "Yes, it's me, your good friend, remember?" "Please forgive me," begged Anansi. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I just wanted to know the people of the land and to see snow before returning home." "How did you get into the snowman?" asked Joshua. "I met Raven and he asked me to help him gather some berries in return for clothes and shelter." "Well, Anansi, it seems as though you met your match." That day, Anansi made a promise that he'd never take advantage of people's goodwill again, and Joshua took him home for the winter. Anansi was expected to help with the chores, to which he agreed. And that's how Anansi came to stay in Canada.